sea never spoke above a whisper in Travank. But sometimes, when the wind dies and the shadows start to press against your thoughts, a quiet story finds you. If you're drawn to forgotten horrors and tales that murmur in the dark, stay close. And if you haven't already, light your lantern by subscribing and leaving a mark below. It helps keep these old stories from slipping back into silence. Travank was a small town, if you could call it that. More a place that happened to have buildings clinging to a hillside like moss on stone. The sea was just beyond the bluff, barely visible unless you walked past the crooked chapel, past the square with no clock, and stood on the old stone arch with iron rusted so long ago no one dared touch it. From there, you could see the gray horizon and wonder, if you stared long enough, whether the world simply ended at that line. The people of Travank did not like to speak of the world beyond. They were not curious nor especially frightened, just quiet, as if they had made a quiet pact with their hills and their salt air, to keep the silence, and in return not be noticed. But once they were noticed, it was in the year 1362, though town records didn't write it down that way. The record keeper had no ink that winter, only charcoal and candle soot. So that year was simply the year of the nightbirds, for reasons no one explained. The only thing written on the town's record sheet, folded and placed beneath the chapel bell, was, "Painter arrived, never left." The painter's name was Emmerich Fail, though he rarely said it aloud. In the years that followed, children only ever called him the Eyes. The elders called him nothing at all. He arrived on the third Tuesday of Lent, walking alone with a leather case and no cart. No horse, no shoes, no hat, only that worn case, strapped to his shoulder, and a short copper bell that rang with each step. It was the only sound he ever made. The children said he wore that bell so he could hear himself moving. He was not young, but not yet bent. His eyes, it was said, did not blink unless he was painting, and even then only if forced. He took residence in the south-facing house, the one with a round attic window and shutters that hadn't closed since the century turned. That house had once belonged to a candlemaker who, according to old stories, went blind one winter trying to craft wax from seawater. Since then, it had stood empty because the door would never quite latch, and the rain liked to come in from the east. But Emmerich did not mind. He did not ask for food. He did not barter. He did not write to his kin, and he did not ask about the church bells, which rang slightly off hour each Sunday. He painted, quietly, obsessively, and only at night. The townsfolk, at first, assumed he was mad. But madness, they agreed, was a private thing. As long as it didn't stain the square or frighten the animals, it could be politely ignored. So, they did not knock, even when they saw his light flickering oddly past midnight, or heard the creaking that sounded not like footsteps but like someone dragging something too large to move. At the end of each month, he placed a single painting in the town square. He never sold them. He simply left them beneath the well rope, pinned with a rusted coin. No one ever saw him place them there, but they were always fresh, always new, and always wrong. They were beautiful in the way that sharp things can be beautiful, but they made the stomach churn in a way no one could explain. The scenes were familiar, fields, the harbor, the crooked chapel, but always something was missing, or added, or misremembered. A fisherman's boat had 5 shadows instead of 1. The chapel bell tower had a doorway where none existed. A dog sat on a windowsill, staring out with the face of a boy who drowned the year before. The mayor, his name was Farden, though no one used it, ordered the paintings burned after the 3rd month. But they did not burn. The edges blackened. The paint bubbled, cracked, even hissed. But each time, the canvas remained. Scorched, yes, but intact. The shapes remained, unblinking, unchanged. The mayor did not order a 4th burned. Instead, he had them sealed behind the town's storehouse wall, bricked in, quietly, as if hiding a shameful confession. No one spoke of them again, and the painter continued to work, undisturbed. For 3 years, he never aged, not visibly. His beard never grew, his nails never yellowed, and his eyes were always open. The baker's youngest said she saw him standing in the window at dawn once, not blinking, not swaying, just watching the light move. But Emmerich did not sleep. Not once. The town midwife, whose name was Isabet, tried once to bring him tea with valerian and poppy seed. He answered the door. She said his eyes looked through her, not passed through, as if searching something behind her ribs. He did not take the tea. That winter, she moved to the coast and was never seen again. Then, in the year of the soft earth, he painted his final piece. He placed no painting in the square that month. Instead, the mayor received a folded note. One word, in shaky ink, "Done." And with that, he vanished. The door to his house was found ajar. His brushes lay cleaned. His pigments were sealed. The attic window, once open, was bricked over from the inside, and in the center of the room was a single canvas, covered by a white cloth and surrounded by salt. Salt from the sea, though he had never once left town. It took the mayor 3 days to decide to look. He brought the priest, 2 aldermen, and a carpenter. Together they lifted the cloth. No one spoke of what they saw, but they sealed the attic that night, with boards, then bricks, then a padlocked grate, and finally a wax seal with the bishop's mark. A mark that meant, "Do not open until judgment." The painter was never found, but some said he had never really been there at all. Only his eyes, and the bell, because sometimes, if you stood by the old stone arch at the bluff's edge, and listened closely on windless nights, you could hear a small copper bell ringing behind you, even when you were alone. There was something strange about the house even before Emmerich arrived. The villagers remembered it differently. No 2 recollections ever matched. Some said the attic window used to be square, others insisted it had always been round. A few old-timers whispered that the house once had a chimney that reached above the chapel roof. But no chimney stood there now. They chalked it up to time, to memory, to moss covering things better left forgotten. But the moment the painter stepped across the crooked threshold, it was as though the house exhaled. Not a single board creaked, not a hinge squealed. Even the wind outside softened, as though agreeing to give him space. The house had stood empty for more than 3 decades, its last occupant buried with no headstone and no hymns. The ground behind it had once been a garden, though nothing ever grew. It was said that nettles withered there, and even mushrooms avoided the shade. Children dared each other to touch the garden soil, and those who did often fell ill, or simply didn't return to the same games anymore. So when Emmerich moved in without hesitation, without asking for blessing or coin, the town quietly took it as a sign. Whether good or ill, they would wait and see. In his first week, nothing stirred. In his second, lights began to flicker past midnight, soft at first, like a candle beneath water, then brighter, shifting between yellow and a cold, pale blue. Sometimes 2 lights would appear, one above, one below, moving independently as though 2 figures wandered the house at once. No one approached, not even the priest. Emmerich spoke to no one. He was seen in town only once that first month, standing beside the old bookbinder's stall, fingers hovering over a stack of blank parchment. He selected 3 pages, not a whole book, just 3 single, loose sheets. He paid with an old Roman coin, green with age. When the binder tried to ask where he'd gotten it, Emmerich had already turned away, the copper bell at his side giving a single muted chime as he walked. By the end of that month, the first painting appeared. It was not placed upright, but face down, beneath the rope of the dried-up town well. A thin, ivory cloth was draped over it. Some said the cloth was torn from an altar robe. Others claimed it was spider silk, too finely woven to be stitched by hand. It was the mayor's son who touched it first. He was 12, braver than he was wise. He pulled back the cloth and stared for a long time before saying a word. When he finally did speak, his voice was too quiet to hear, and his eyes were wider than before. The image showed the town square, but everything was off. The shadows were too long. The well had no rope, and every window on every house was open, though the people inside were all turned away from the viewer, their backs stiff as though waiting to be called. The only face visible in the painting was his own, standing exactly where he was standing. Only the sky behind him was black, not nighttime black, but ink black, as if light had been scraped out. The mayor ordered it removed. He stored it in the cellar of the chapel beneath a canvas shroud. But by morning, the painting was gone. The canvas remained. So did the cloth. But the board had vanished. In its place, someone had drawn a perfect circle in the dust. Inside the circle, a single copper bell. That was when the townsfolk began keeping candles lit at night. Not just in homes, but on windowsills and along fences and even on the church roof. The butcher placed one in the eye socket of a sheep's skull. The schoolmaster lined 3 along the stairs. No one agreed to do this, they simply did. And Emmerich painted on. Each month, a new painting arrived. Each one stranger than the last. One showed the harbor, but the boats were all floating above the water, their sails tattered and flapping against a sky made of stitched cloth. Another displayed the chapel, but the bell tower had windows inside it, and behind each window was a face pressed close, mouths open in silent scream. None of the paintings could be traced to a known style. They were not Gothic, not sacred, not illuminated manuscript or even pagan. They were something older, sharper, colder. Shapes that felt wrong even if they followed the rules of perspective. Colors that didn't quite exist in the real world, but felt familiar in dreams. A local historian, brought in from the port city of Camleth, examined one before it was sealed away. He claimed the brushstrokes moved when you weren't looking, that the lines shifted, subtly, like breath. He returned to Camleth within hours, never speaking of the visit again. Soon, the townspeople developed a rule. Never look too long. 3 breaths. That was all. Any longer and the details began to change. Some swore that if you stared into the shadows within the painting, they would blink, or reach, or whisper. And then there was the attic. By the 2nd year, children reported seeing a light glowing behind the attic's round window. A pulsing glow, like a heart trying to remember how to beat. Sometimes it would flicker rhythmically. Other times it would flash in quick bursts, 3, then 5, then 7. No one dared investigate. A wandering tinker who tried to rent the attic room during a stormy autumn vanished the night he stayed. His cart and horse were still tied out front. His hat was found beside the fire, but he was never seen again. The next morning, the light behind the attic window was brighter than ever. That was the same week the baker found a copper bell baked into a loaf of bread. Not melted, not cracked, perfect, untouched, like it had been placed there just before the dough turned golden. And still Emmerich did not speak. He did not age. He did not rest. He only painted, and the paintings only grew stranger. And behind the window the glow began to take shape, forming not just light, but something inside the light. Something watching, something waiting. Trevink had always been a quiet town, but after the 3rd year of Emmerich's arrival, the silence changed. It wasn't just stillness anymore. It was intentional, like every breath was being held, like even the wind was waiting for something. People began to forget words. Not important ones, not first, but the small ones, the soft ones. A child forgot how to say butterfly. A blacksmith forgot the word hammer. The old woman who ran the lampstand stood for an hour unable to name the flame. And in every case, when someone lost a word, they would pause and glance toward the painter's house. No one said this aloud, of course. It was just something they all knew. A hush passed over the village like frost. The priest, Father Alric, noticed it first in his sermons. Words he had spoken for 40 years now tasted strange. Passages from the Book of Days came out garbled, and when he tried to repeat them, his mouth filled with the taste of salt. He tried to write down his experiences in the chapel's logbook, but each night, his ink would run dry before he finished his first sentence, even when he filled the well himself. Eventually, he stopped trying. The bell ringer stopped ringing the bell. The town crier no longer cried. The children stopped singing, and no one went near the attic window. By then, the glow had changed. It was no longer soft or pulsing. It throbbed in sharp bursts, like the flash of lightning beneath a storm cloud, but silent, utterly silent. On the new moon, it turned red, and once, just once, it flickered in time with a heartbeat. But no one in the town could sleep that night to be sure if it was their own. The mayor, pale and gaunt now, called for a vote. Not in the square, not aloud. On slips of paper, passed hand to hand. The question was simple. Should we remove him? But when the folded votes were opened, each paper was blank. Each one, every sheet, every scrap, even the mayor's own. Later that night, someone or something nailed a canvas to the chapel door. It hadn't been painted. It had been burned. Charcoal and ash smeared across white cloth. The image was of a man with no mouth and too many eyes. Not painted in, but pressed into the surface, dark impressions, as if someone with fire-blackened fingers had tried to remember a face. The priest fainted. The cloth was removed by morning, but its outline remained, lightly scorched into the chapel door. Rain would never wash it away. Even when the door was replaced, the outline appeared again days later on the new wood, as if something wanted to be remembered. That was when the whispers began. Not spoken, heard, from inside the paintings. No one admitted this at first. Came slowly. Someone would pause longer than usual in the square, or step away from the chapel's back wall a little too quickly, or turn pale just passing the carpenter's shed, where one of the earlier works had been sealed beneath the floorboards. Some said the whispers spoke in Latin. Others claimed it was a language older than bones. A few, just a few, said it was their own voice, speaking fears they'd never shared. One man, the baker's apprentice, sat too long near the well where Emmerich's third painting had once rested. He stared at the stone for hours. When he returned home, he could not stop whispering. He whispered in sleep. He whispered while chewing. He whispered into bowls and corners and locked cabinets. Then one morning he was gone. His boots were found by the chapel gate. Inside one of them, a copper bell. No one knew where Emmerich found the bells. They were all the same, tiny, bright despite no polish, with no clapper inside. They didn't ring when shaken, only when placed. Each one gave a soft, short chime the moment it touched stone. And each time, someone vanished within the week. No one saw him move anymore. He was no longer glimpsed buying parchment. The windows remained closed, the door untouched, but the paintings continued to appear, slipped into the world like cracks in memory. The 20th painting arrived in the spring of 1365. It was unlike the others. This one showed Trevenc itself from above, from high above, the whole town, rendered in impossible detail, every window, every street curve, even the faint outlines of roots beneath the earth. And at the very center of the town stood a figure, arms raised to the sky, the face smeared into an open blur. But around the edges of the painting were others, 12 figures, small, pale, standing far outside the borders of the town, watching, waiting. There was no canvas this time. The painting had been burned directly into the well's stone, and at its center, placed gently into a carved groove, was the largest copper bell anyone had yet seen. It rang without sound. People wept when they saw it, not from fear, not from beauty, from something older than those words, like a sorrow they couldn't name, or a memory that had never belonged to them. The mayor fell ill that same day. His final words, before he lost the ability to speak altogether, were whispered to his wife. It's not the paintings. It's what he saw before he painted them. By midsummer, no one spoke anymore. It wasn't forbidden. It simply felt unsafe. The painter's house, once just a presence, now loomed, not in size but in weight, like a stone in the middle of a still pond. And the attic window had begun to flicker again, not just red, but blue, green, violet, as if something behind it was trying to speak in color. And behind it all, the whisper of bells. Not one, not two, but many, always distant, always behind, and always just before sleep. The year the bells multiplied, no one in Trevenc dreamed, not a single one. This was not discovered all at once. It surfaced gradually, as most strange things do in places built on silence. First, a mother mentioned her child hadn't cried out in sleep for weeks, not even a murmur. Then, the schoolmaster noted the drawings his students made were flat, lifeless. No monsters, no wings, no nonsense, No dreams. By the third week of Lent, the priest confirmed it. He tried every rite he knew. Holy water, candle vigils, psalms in Latin, then in the old tongue of the hill tribes. But nothing returned to them, not even nightmares. The town was awake always, just softer, thinner, as though whatever tethered them to rest had been quietly snipped. They slept, yes, some even deeply, but it was the sleep of wood or stone, dreamless and echoless, a kind of waiting that never quite refreshed. Even the animals noticed. Dogs no longer twitched in their beds. Cats stopped staring at corners. Horses would not close their eyes unless blindfolded. And behind it all, the attic window watched. The glow had changed again. Now it shimmered, like oil across a still pond. Sometimes it seemed to ripple downward, as though it was not a light at all, but a curtain, and something behind it was beginning to move. No one dared knock on the painter's door, not even the traveling bishop who arrived that spring. He was a large man, silver-robed and sharp-eyed, with 2 scribes and a caged dove. He entered the town square with holy banners, demanding the source of the unrest. The townsfolk gave no answer. They simply looked, all at once, toward the south-facing house on the hill. The bishop went himself. The scribes refused to follow. He climbed the path slowly. 3 times he paused, once to pray, once to remove his hat, once to breathe. Then he vanished behind the door. He remained inside for 11 minutes. When he returned, he walked past the square, past the chapel, past the outer stones of the graveyard, and sat beside the boundary tree. He stayed there until dusk, said nothing, ate nothing. Then he stood, left his banner tied to the roots, and walked away. He did not take his scribes. He did not take the dove. He never returned. The dove, when released, flew in circles over the house for 3 days before dropping dead. The mayor died in his sleep that week. His wife found him with a copper bell beneath his pillow and a smile too wide for his face. His eyes were open, dried, as though he had been smiling for days. He was buried with the bell, but it did not stay buried. 2 nights later, the sexton found it on the chapel steps, clean, untouched, as though freshly forged. He placed it on the chapel altar, beneath a cloth of wine-dark velvet. It rang just once at dawn. After that, no one touched it, and no one moved the cloth. The painter still did not appear, but his presence deepened, like sediment settling at the bottom of a lake. You could feel it in the bones, behind the teeth, in the brittle pause before saying a name. Children no longer played outside. Shutters were kept closed, even on windless days. And the sky began to forget its color. Not all at once, but subtly, faintly. The blue of morning became pale, nearly silver. The clouds, when they formed, no longer cast shadows. And the stars at night flickered out one by one, as if embarrassed to be seen. The town's archivist wrote one final entry before losing the ability to form coherent letters. The space between seconds is widening. It made no sense, but those who read it agreed, felt true. Even the clocks began to hesitate. The town's only bell tower, beside the chapel, would sometimes ring at the wrong hour, sometimes twice. Once, it rang 13 times at midnight. The bellringer swore he'd only pulled the rope once. The clockmaker tried to fix it. 3 days later, he was found sitting in his workshop, motionless, staring at the inside of a grandfather clock. His gears were missing, every single one. Not stolen, just not there. In their place, etched into the inner wall, was a single line of paint. Unmistakable, Emmerich's brushwork. It was deep blue, the color of dreams no one could remember. That was when the town agreed, in unspoken glances and breathless nods, to seal the attic. Not the house, no one dared cross that threshold, but the attic. A ladder was placed from the outside, nailed into stone. Bricks were hauled from the blacksmith's unused kiln. Mortar was mixed without words, just gestures. The chapel boys brought ash to mix into the grout, and together, as one breathless town, they sealed the round attic window. From the outside, the moment the final brick was placed, the glow behind it disappeared. No shimmer, no flicker, just dark. And for the first time in years, Travenk felt something close to relief. The silence was still there. The bells still whispered, but the pressure lightened, like a storm moving on, if only slightly. That night, someone dreamed. Just one person, the schoolmaster's wife. She awoke sobbing. Her husband, shaken, asked her what she had seen. She could not say, only that it was not her dream, and that it had looked directly at her from behind the bricks. In the weeks that followed the sealing of the attic, Travenk began to pretend. It was not celebration. It was not relief. It was simply denial practiced like prayer. The shutters opened again, though never fully. Candles returned to windowsills, not for fear, but for decoration. The chapel resumed its bells, though never at night. People began speaking again, slowly, gently. The first words spoken aloud in the town square were "more bread," offered at the market like a test. The baker nodded, handed the loaf, and did not blink. It was enough. No one mentioned the painter. No one mentioned the bells. And absolutely no one mentioned the attic. But silence is not easily unlearned. Every conversation remained soft, each laugh a breath too shallow, and all footsteps leaned toward the edges of the street, as if making room for something that no longer walked there, but might return. The south-facing house stood still, shuttered and blank. No paintings had appeared since the ceiling. No lights flickered. No new bells. The earth beneath it grew quiet, and then the floorboards began to shift. It started with a groan, soft, like wood stretching in its sleep. Then came the buckling just near the chapel. The ground beneath the altar lifted, ever so slightly, like something pressed upward from below. The priest, older now, trembling from more than age, commanded the chapel be closed for repairs. But there were no repairs, only a locked door, a quiet sign, and a growing tension beneath the floor. On the third Sunday after sealing the attic, the carpenter awoke to find a painting nailed beneath his bed. He had not heard hammering. He lived alone. The nails were smooth, set clean, and the canvas new, damp to the touch as if painted only hours before. He unfastened it, carried it outside, and unfurled it in the square just as the sun rose. The town watched in silence. The painting showed a cross-section of the carpenter's house, as if the walls had been peeled away. Inside, each room was perfectly detailed. His tools, his food stores, even a mouse hole behind the oven he had never noticed. But beneath the house, in the earth below the foundation, was something impossible. A hidden room, circular, windowless. At its center stood a figure with a brush in one hand, a mirror in the other, and no face at all. Just an open canvas where skin should be, half painted, the other half reflecting the viewer's own expression. The moment the town looked away, the painting was gone. No one saw it vanish, but it was no longer in the square, and the carpenter's hands were clean. No paint, no ash, no smell of turpentine, but a bell lay where he'd stood. Not copper this time, ivory. The priest called for an emergency gathering. No parchment, no vote, just voices, each one cracking like old timber. They spoke in half sentences, shared glances, and the occasional muttered plea. They debated burning the house. They debated digging beneath it. They debated fleeing the town altogether. But in the end, they did what Travenk always did best. They chose to wait, and whisper, and pretend they hadn't seen what they saw. Only one man did not attend the gathering, the gravedigger. He was found that night near the bluff, his shovel planted into the grass, his eyes closed, and a strange smile on his lips. A copper bell sat on his tongue, perfectly balanced. He wasn't dead, but he would never wake again. His chest rose and fell like a dreamer's, but he remained unmoving, untouched by cold or thirst. They laid him in the chapel, but 3 nights later, the bell was missing. In its place, a strip of parchment, too old to be modern, but too clean to be forgotten. On it, painted in a single brushstroke of blue, was the image of a closed eye, not painted onto the parchment but inside it, as though the parchment itself had remembered something and bled. That week, The baker's son began drawing again. He had not picked up charcoal in months. Now his fingers moved with unnatural speed. When his mother asked what he was sketching, he whispered, "Where the painter sleeps." She burned the sketches before looking, but the next day his bedsheets were covered in ink. Drawn with no brush, no pen, only fingertip. All of them were maps, not of places that existed, but of places that felt remembered. Spiral roads, towerless castles, wells that opened upward, and in the corner of every map, a single brushstroke, curved, blue, like the mark left behind by a dream you didn't have but missed. The town's denial began to crack. It didn't break, not yet, but it wavered. The priest stopped sleeping inside the chapel. The carpenter refused to step onto bare floorboards. The baker salted every doorway, and from behind the bricked attic window, something began to breathe. Not loud, not heavy, just the slow rhythm of something not quite alive, remembering how. And on windless nights, when sleep refused to come and candles burned low, the people of Travenk would lie still and listen, for the canvas beneath the floor, for the whisper of bells, for the brush that had never stopped painting. Before Emmerich Fail came to Travenk, his name had not been spoken in over 100 years. It wasn't that he had lived long. It wasn't that he had died and returned. It was something stranger. The name itself had been erased, deliberately, gently, like dust brushed off a windowsill. All records where it once appeared had missing pages. All letters where it was written had torn corners. Every signature he may have left behind was replaced by an ink blot, or a thumbprint, or silence. It was as if the world had once tried to forget him, and failed. Only one record survived, a half-rotted ledger from a scriptorium on the eastern coast. Inside, a final note from a monk whose handwriting was barely legible, smudged and panicked. He paints with memory, not his own. That record surfaced in Travenk the same day the carpenter's dog began howling at the bricked attic wall. A coincidence, some whispered, but the archivist, before falling ill, insisted it wasn't. Emmerich had left something behind. Not an object, not a painting, a name, not his true one, but the name he used before, a name that didn't belong in Travenk, a name that made the air colder to speak. The blacksmith found it first, carved into the underside of an anvil he'd used for 20 years. Not scratched, not etched, but painted beneath the iron in dry ochre pigment. It read, Morrison. He asked no one what it meant. He simply sealed the forge and left it cold. That same night, several townsfolk dreamed again. And every dream began with the same image. A canvas, vast and empty, stretching beyond the horizon like a desert of raw cloth. And in the center, a figure crouched, tiny, faceless, holding a brush made of bone and hair. The figure was painting the dream itself. As the dreamer walked closer, the sky above turned white, not bright, blank, as though it too were a canvas being prepared. Some woke with tears, others with nausea. One woman could not stop scratching her arms, whispering, get it off, until the priest arrived and held her hand until dawn. No one could say what it was, but they all felt it now. The painter had not stopped painting. He had simply begun a different kind of canvas. The town, the people, the very air. The attic, though sealed, was no longer quiet. Late at night, a sound would rise from behind the bricks. Not knocking, not scratching, a slow, rhythmic brushing, as if someone were painting from the inside, along the brick's inner curve. Soft, repetitive, patient. The carpenter was the first to break. He woke in the middle of the night with paint on his fingertips. He hadn't owned brushes in years. When he lit a lamp, he found a canvas stretched across his wall. Not hung, not tacked, but growing out of the wood, as if the plaster itself had unpeeled into stretched cloth. On it was a single eye, closed, but when he blinked, it blinked back. He collapsed before dawn. When neighbors found him, he was seated in front of the wall, eyes shut, breathing slow, but utterly silent. No words would come from his mouth, not even a breathy vowel. A copper bell lay in his lap. That was the third. 3 bells. 3 sleepers, all unmoving, all with traces of paint on their skin. The town's fear no longer whispered, pulsed, like a second heartbeat beneath the streets. The priest held one last sermon. Not in the chapel, it had been abandoned since the floor began to pulse, but in the market square. A circle of candles marked the center. Everyone came. No one sat. He spoke softly, too softly, but all could hear. His message was simple. The painter does not live in that house. He never did. He lives in us, and he is not finished. Then he unrolled a scroll none had seen before. It was not parchment. It was canvas, thin, stretched, and painted with a single line. A hand, emerging from behind a curtain, holding a brush, and behind it, dozens of shapes, obscured, faceless, watching, not waiting, not hiding, just present. The priest gave no explanation. He folded the canvas again, placed it on the stone, and walked away. No one followed. But that night, every dog in Trevenk began to howl. All at once. Not in fear, not in pain, in warning. Their eyes locked on the south-facing house. Not on the attic, on the ground beneath it, because the earth had begun to soften. Not crack, not shake. Soften like cloth dipped in water, like canvas, stretched and primed. Ready. The first time the ground gave way, it didn't crack or split. Peeled. It began behind the chapel, just past the old fig tree where the roots had always grown crooked. The soil there had always been stubborn, too hard to till, too soft to build upon. Children called it the sponge earth. Adults pretended it wasn't there at all. But one morning, the fig tree was gone. Not fallen, not cut, gone. In its place was a clean, white surface, perfectly smooth, cold to the touch. Not stone, not wood, something else. Something that made the tongue dry and the skin ache. The priest was called to see it. He knelt, placed both hands on the surface, whispered a psalm, then whispered again, then leaned in close. When he stood, he was pale, paler than death. He turned to the gathered townsfolk and spoke 3 words. He's painting us. No one asked who. No one needed to. The surface behind the chapel spread in the days that followed. Slowly, unnervingly smooth. Birds would not land on it. Rain did not soak into it. Dust did not settle. It remained perfectly blank, as though waiting for the first line. And then that line arrived. On the 7th day, in the pale dawn, a brushstroke appeared. Just one. A single dark blue arc. It stretched from one end of the smooth surface to the other, thin, deliberate, and damp as if freshly painted. But no one had seen it drawn. No one had approached in the night. And there were no footprints on the blankness surrounding it. Just the stroke. A beginning. The archivist, before losing speech entirely, managed to write 2 final notes in his ledger. The line matches the one beneath the chapel bell. This isn't a painting of us. It's a painting made from us. The second note caused the ink in his quill to curdle. He was found the next day with his hand still clutching it, fingers stained black. From that day on, the town did not step on the surface. They built makeshift bridges, wooden planks across rooftops, ladders slung between chimneys, ropes tied across balconies. Anything to avoid touching the canvas now growing through their soil like a second skin. The surface crept forward, not fast, but steady. By midsummer, it had taken part of the well, the chapel steps, and most of the graveyard. The dead did not resist, but the bells began to ring again, faintly, far away, as if from below. The sound was wrong, not metal, bone, like something delicate and ancient clattering softly beneath the blankness, following the lines that had not yet been painted. Then, one morning, the painter's house trembled. Not the way houses tremble in storms. The way lungs do just before a scream. The bricks around the attic window, sealed months ago, shifted outward. Not cracked, not broken, pushed, as if something from the inside had exhaled. The townspeople gathered at a distance. No one moved closer. They waited. Then, slowly, softly, the bricks fell inward, one by one, into the attic they had sealed. Inside, There was no light, only a blankness deeper than shadow, a blankness that felt familiar, like the surface now growing beneath their town. For the first time in years, Emmerich Fail stepped into view. He did not look changed. He did not look aged. He did not blink. But he held no brush, only a mirror. His frame was made of bone. Its glass was cloudy, rippling slightly as if stirred from the other side. He raised it slowly, not to the crowd, not to the town, but to the sky. And in the sky, something rippled back. Something vast, indescribable, but watching. The mirror flashed, only once, and then the attic fell dark again. The painter vanished. The mirror was gone. But that night, the entire town dreamed the same dream. They stood on a white surface, canvas, endless, a single line traced beneath their feet, drawing circles around them, one by one. In the distance, a figure painted with its own shadow. Each stroke stole a breath. Each breath changed the color of the sky. When the dreamers awoke, they found faint blue lines on their soles, and the surface had reached their doors. By the time the surface reached the center of Trevenk, the town no longer remembered its own name. It wasn't sudden. It happened softly, like a sound slipping beneath water, muffled and lost. Street signs faded. Letters fell from stones. Even the chapel's cornerstone, once carved with the founding year, was now blank. The schoolmaster, who had long kept a map of the region, stared for hours at the parchment pinned to his wall. The town was no longer marked, just an empty spot between hills, as if it had been unwritten. Those who attempted to say the name choked, not violently, just stopped. Their mouths opened, their voices lifted, and then something halted, as if the air itself had become too thick for syllables. Even the priest, who had spoken it 1,000 times in prayer, gave up. Instead, they referred to it as here. Here's bread. Here's shelter. Here we wait. But everyone knew they weren't truly here anymore. Not completely, because the canvas had taken the square. Where once cobblestones had cracked and groaned beneath cartwheels, there was now only blankness. Smooth, white, expanding, and in its center, a figure began to form, drawn in layers, day by day. First a pair of feet, then legs, then a torso, arms, never a face. Not yet. The figure was painted as though reclining, as if asleep or pretending to be. One hand rested over its chest. The other held a brush. Its bristles were real, actual horsehair, tied with twine, stuck to the canvas as if grown from it. And from the hand, blue lines extended outward, trailing like veins, crawling across the surface, reaching toward every house, every shop, every roof. Each day, the lines grew bolder. Each night, more of the town was absorbed. Roofs flattened into white. Doors became outlines. Windows softened into smears of light. The town wasn't being destroyed. It was being translated, turned into something else. Not language, not art, a memory, but not theirs. The archivist had said it best, before he lost his voice entirely. He's not recording what he sees. He's repainting what he remembers. That was when the statues arrived. No one built them. No one sculpted. They simply appeared, small at first, child height, made of some pale, soft stone that never cracked and never warmed. They stood silently in doorways, on rooftops, on empty beds. Some looked like people, some didn't, but all of them watched the center of the canvas. All of them faced the reclining figure. One of the statues stood outside the mayor's old house. It wore a mask, painted eyes, no mouth, one hand raised, fingers gently curved as if about to knock. But the door was already open. The house had no floor anymore, only white, only brushstrokes. The blacksmith tried to leave. He packed a bag, kissed his wife, and set off down the eastern road. He returned 12 minutes later, not walking, sliding, as if carried back by something beneath the earth. He said nothing, dropped his bag, removed his shoes, stepped onto the canvas, and vanished. No splash, no scream, just a ripple, and gone. That was the last attempt. The road itself disappeared by morning, swallowed, flattened, transformed into the same featureless space as everything else. Nowhere led away, only inward, only toward the figure with no face. By the third week, half the townsfolk had stopped speaking entirely. Not out of fear, out of instinct. Words no longer fit. Language bent strangely in their mouths, as if something beneath the tongue disagreed with it. Even gestures grew uncertain, as if memory of what hands were for had begun to fray. And yet, there was no panic, no screams, no running, just quiet acceptance. Not peaceful, but inevitable. The priest lasted longest. He held nightly vigils at the edge of the growing blankness, placing candles in concentric circles and whispering forgotten hymns to the corners of the dark. One night, he looked into the mirror he'd once confiscated from the chapel's altar. It had grown cloudy. He wiped it. Inside was his own reflection, yes, but altered, painted, flat. His eyes had brushstrokes in them, blue, like veins blooming outward from the iris. He dropped the mirror. The next morning, his hands were stiff, no longer flesh, but stretched linen, taut, cold. He did not resist. He walked barefoot to the figure in the square, lay down beside it, and curled into a mirrored pose. By dawn, the canvas had claimed him. Now there were two figures, one painted, one real, but both were fading, blending, becoming lines. And overhead, the sky began to crack. Not loudly, not with thunder, just a faint splitting sound, like a paintbrush being dragged across parchment. Thin white lines stretched from horizon to horizon. A frame. The town, what was left of it, was being finished. But the painter himself had not been seen since the attic reopened. Only his works, only his touch, only the whisper of a bell beneath every heartbeat. The sky broke on a Wednesday. It didn't fall, peeled, not like clouds dispersing, not like storm fronts rolling in, but like parchment curling at the corners, lifting from a wetboard. At first, only the children noticed, those few who still remembered what clouds were supposed to look like. They pointed upward, not in fear, but in awe. The sky shimmered in horizontal streaks, as if it had been painted in haste and left unfinished. Then came the shadows, not cast by sun or moon, neither had been visible in weeks, but by figures overhead, suspended like brushstrokes. Shapes that didn't quite move, didn't quite stay still, hung in place like thoughts that hadn't decided whether to be remembered. And with them came the smell. Not decay, not smoke, but turpentine, thick, acrid, familiar only to those who'd visited the painter's house in its early days, when the scent had still clung to his doorway like fog, coated the air now, slipped into lungs, settled in the tongue. The town began coughing in unison, not violently, but rhythmically, like a choir rehearsing the wrong hymn. By the following night, all sound vanished. Utter silence. No wind, no speech, no footfalls. Even the bells, once whispering just beneath awareness, fell quiet. It was the kind of silence that doesn't leave room for return, the kind that makes you afraid to think too loudly. And yet, the painting in the center of town continued. The reclining figure now had half a face, painted in soft blue layers, each line carefully placed, so deliberate it hurt to look at for too long. The face looked peaceful but deeply wrong. Its eyes were too wide. Its mouth only hinted at being a mouth at all, just a crescent suggestion in the white. Some said it looked like the priest. Others thought it looked like themselves. One woman fainted when she saw her own birthmark rendered perfectly on the painted forehead. But by morning, the image had changed again. The face no longer resembled anyone living. It resembled someone watching, someone who had never blinked, someone who had waited for a canvas large enough. And now, the town itself had grown quietly stretched. The buildings were taller than they used to be, not higher, just drawn that way. Their windows no longer held glass, only reflections. Even the animals had changed. The few that remained moved in slow, exaggerated gestures, as if caught mid-illustration. A dog trotted past the baker's empty shop with only 3 legs, but left 5 shadows. No one reacted. No one even watched. There were no more reactions now, only placement. Each person in Trevenk stood in just the right position, as though posed by an unseen hand. Even when they moved, they did so like marionettes caught between stillness and story. Then, in the middle of the silent square, a new sound. A brushstroke. One single, smooth stroke, long, clean, final. And with it, Emmerich Fail returned. Not through a door, not from a street, but through the canvas itself. He stepped out of it, as if passing through gauze, face half-shadowed, body smeared at the edges like wet paint. In his right hand, the brush. In his left, nothing. But the air curled around it as though he carried something vast. Something invisible. He didn't speak. He didn't blink. He only walked, through the center of town, past the baker's house, past the chapel, past the edge of what used to be the inn. And with each step, the canvas grew beneath him. Not as if he painted it, as if it unfurled to meet him, responded, welcomed. Behind him, the painted figure lay still, now fully formed, his face, but younger, almost childlike. And beside it, a second figure began to form, curled inward, hands over its ears, eyes closed, no brush, only a mirror in its lap. And from its reflection, a dozen townsfolk saw their own faces, drawn, distorted, but unmistakably theirs, floating just beneath the glass. When Emmerich reached the southern edge of town, he stopped, looked upward, raised the brush, and made one final line, a great arching stroke across the horizon itself. The sky peeled back, and behind it nothing, not stars, not darkness, just a white so bright and so deep it hummed in the chest. And from that brightness, a shape stepped forward, not human, not monstrous, not describable, only aware. It did not touch the ground. It did not speak. It simply looked down at Emmerich and nodded, just once. And in that moment, every sleeper in Trevenk, the ones laid in beds, sealed behind chapel walls, vanished beneath floorboards, opened their eyes, and smiled. When the sleepers smiled, the town stopped pretending to be real. Buildings no longer echoed when entered. Floors no longer groaned beneath footfall. Shadows moved without reason, some casting sideways, some standing still. One flickered gently like candlelight, though no flame was nearby. Trevenk was no longer a town. It was a composition. Each object, each path, each person now felt placed, intended, weighted not with function but with meaning, but not theirs. Even the oldest among them, those who remembered winter bread and quiet baptisms and the ringing of the harvest bell, now found themselves posed beside doorways they had never stood near, wearing expressions they had not chosen. And yet, they did not resist. They only stood, watched, waited. The sleepers, those who had fallen into dreamless states months ago, had risen, but they did not return to their homes. They each stood at the edges of the canvas that now covered most of the valley, their hands folded, faces tilted slightly upward, gazing at the line in the sky that Emmerich had drawn. They were no longer made of skin. Their forms were fabric-like, their eyes painted glass, their limbs wrapped in the faint stretch of linen and gesso. They were part of the painting now, still alive, still breathing, but translated, made into something halfway between flesh and form, between memory and pigment. The town called them the Framed. No one remembered when that name began. No one needed to. It was simply understood. And in the center of the square, beside the reclining figure that wore Emmerich's younger face, the second figure, mirror holder, eyes closed, had gained detail. A crown of ivy, a necklace of rusted keys, a tear painted in fine red across the cheek, too delicate to have been brushed, as though whispered into the paint. The mirror in its lap now showed a third figure, just beginning to form. Not yet visible, only a hand, outstretched, pointing not outward but inward into the mirror itself, as though it were reaching for the viewer or inviting them to reach back. The town's remaining few, the unpainted, the unclaimed, watched as their neighbors, one by one, stepped into their own reflections. They did not scream. They did not hesitate. They simply vanished with a faint stroke of color, their bodies fading into brush lines that crawled up the buildings, across the rooftops, into the frame that the sky had become. The priest's final words, written in charcoal beside the chapel bell before the wind took them, were these: "There is no end, only the completion of intention." By now, even nature had given way. Trees stood still mid-bend, caught in sweeping arcs. Birds hovered in frozen loops of flight, as if waiting to be colored in. The stream behind the blacksmith's shop no longer flowed, but hung in a suspended curl of blue-gray swirls, painted thickly against the air like strokes caught mid-breath. The town was no longer being changed. It was being finished. And Emmerich, he had returned to the attic, not to rest, not to hide, to watch. He stood at the open window, the bricks long forgotten, and looked down at the canvas of the town with the gaze of one who had already seen this before, as if he had painted it once and forgotten, only to find his hands repeating the memory again. He did not blink. He did not age, but something behind his eyes moved, and that night the figure in the mirror opened its eyes. They were the same as his, but they wept, softly, without sound, just two long brushstrokes down the cheeks, shimmering, blue, wet, and at that moment, something shifted in the white sky. The brightness dimmed, just slightly, enough to reveal the presence of frames. Dozens, hundreds, as though the sky itself were a gallery wall, each glowing rectangle holding a scene like Trevenk. Some were finished, some still being outlined, and one, just one, was blank. A single white frame with no canvas, no figures, no color, only an open space, waiting. For 3 days, the blank frame in the sky remained untouched. No lines, no figures, no brushstrokes, just a silent rectangle of light, hovering above the hills like a window left open too long. And it watched, not in the way eyes do, but in the way absence does. Its presence was felt in the gaps between thoughts, in the pause between the turning of a head and the blinking of an eye. Some in the town, those who still remembered movement, found themselves glancing toward it without meaning to, drawn by the pull of potential. It wasn't empty, it was hungry. Below, Emmerich did not move. He stood each day in the attic, still as canvas, his arms at his sides, his brush untouched on the sill. The townsfolk, those who remained human in shape, began to gather outside his house, not in fear or anger, but in quiet expectancy, as though they had always done so, as though their lives had been painted leading to this precise posture. And in that moment the frame twitched, not violently, not even visibly, just enough to unsettle the light, just enough to ripple the fabric of the air like someone breathing too close to wet paint. And with that ripple came a sound, not from the frame, from the ground, from beneath the painting, a groan, not of stone or timber, but of memory straining against its bindings. A dozen townsfolk collapsed, not from illness, but from recognition. They remembered names that were not theirs, homes they'd never lived in, songs they had never sung but could hum now perfectly. The painter had not just painted them into his work. He had painted through them, layered them into something else, something older, something that had existed before Trevenk had a name, before it was a town, before the hills had trees. They began whispering the forgotten tongue, not Latin, not prayer, not even sound, just the rhythm of strokes, meant to be felt, not heard. They etched it with their footsteps, with their glances, with their sleep, and at last Emmerich moved. One finger lifted, a slow curl inward, as if beckoning not a person, but a moment, and the sky obeyed. The blank frame descended, not falling, just lowering itself like a curtain drawn between X. It stopped inches above the town square, and from its edges, threads unspooled, fine lines of golden fiber, drifting down, attaching themselves to rooftops, windowsills, and hearts. They did not pull, they did not bind, they simply connected, and in that moment the painting began again. From below, the canvas beneath the town peeled upward, as if revealing another layer, an underpainting long forgotten. Buildings vanished, people dissolved into lines, streets unwound into loops and arcs, But beneath it all, something else was there. An older town. Stone paths now returned. Walls blackened by fire long past. Crumbling towers. Ancient wells filled with salt and teeth. And writing everywhere. Etched into stone, scrawled across doorways, stamped onto bone. Symbols that pulsed faintly as though inked with heartbeat. The townsfolk, those who still remained, recognized none of it. But Emmerich did. He stepped down from the attic without descending. He simply appeared at the center of the revealed town, where a rotunda once stood, now returned in pale stone and broken columns. He stood at its heart, and began to paint again, not with his brush, but with his gaze. Where he looked, lines formed. Where he blinked, color bled. Where he breathed, detail emerged, walls, trees, people, but not the ones who had lived in Trevenk. Strangers, from a time before, their features unfamiliar, but terribly human. Eyes sunken from knowledge, not hunger. Hands built for holding secrets, not tools. One reached toward the frame in the sky, and touched it, and when that happened, the final change began. The sky turned into canvas. The air thickened into paint, and the world at last remembered it had been made once with intention, and could be unmade the same way. They had called it Trevenk for as long as memory allowed. But memory, it seemed, was just another layer, and memory, like paint, could be stripped. What rose now from beneath the curled-back canvas was not the town they knew, nor anything built by the people they believed themselves to be. The stones were too old, too smooth. The mortar glimmered faintly, flecked with pigment. Each path curved inward, drawing the eye toward the square. Not the familiar one, with its old well and broken arch, but a circular platform of black stone that hummed beneath bare feet. It had been hidden beneath them all along. Every house, every chapel, every whispered sermon had merely covered it. And now, revealed, it whispered, not in language, in invitation. Emmerich stood at its center, still as ever. His hands were folded behind his back. His shadow had no shape. Around him, the framed gathered, dozens now, their bodies wrapped in cloth that fluttered without wind, their eyes painted but wet, their mouths curved upward, but silent. Their feet left no prints. They encircled the black stone, knelt, and waited. From the northern slope, the remaining few townsfolk watched. There were only 7 now, still unpainted, still breathing real air, still speaking, though only in whispers and only to each other. One, the baker's widow, clutched her son's toy, a wooden cart that had never rolled straight. She hadn't spoken since the day her house turned to charcoal lines. Another, the schoolmaster's apprentice, kept blinking hard, as if he could unsee the painted sky by sheer force of will. They hadn't run, not because they were brave, because there was nowhere to run. And beneath their feet, even now, the grass shifted, becoming flatter, lighter, thinner, like parchment, like waiting space. Then the stone platform cracked, not from pressure, from within. Lines appeared, delicate at first, then sharp, spidering outward in arcs and spirals. Not randomly, not destructively, but with structure, as though the stone had been etched before, and had simply remembered how to reveal itself. And from those lines came images, paintings, not on the surface, within it. Beneath the blackness, lit from an unknown source, scenes unfolded like memories played in water. A gathering of robed figures, painting the sky with ink-dipped reeds. A city burning, its flames rising into scrolls. A child with no face, standing on a brush as long as a river. And then, finally, Emmerich, younger, barefoot, kneeling before a massive canvas that stretched beyond the horizon. But he was not painting. He was erasing, one stroke at a time, careful, focused, regretful. The scene shimmered and collapsed. The stone darkened, and the frame in the sky grew brighter, as if the memory had fed it. Emmerich turned slowly, faced the hill, faced the 7 who still stood apart. His gaze did not threaten. It did not command. It offered a chance to step forward, a chance to belong to the thing being finished, a chance to let go of this version of things, of their version. of memory itself, and for a long, frozen minute, none of them moved. Then, the schoolmaster's apprentice stepped forward. One step, then another, and with each, his boots darkened. Not wet, not muddy, just darker, as if being shaded from underneath. When he reached the edge of the stone, he paused, looked once at the toy cart still clutched in the widow's hand, then stepped forward and joined the framed. His breath slowed, his skin paled, his eyes closed, and a smile, faint, peaceful, formed. He faded gently into the circle, not like a person dying, like a brush drying. And then the platform spoke, not aloud, but through every line it had ever hidden. Begin again. Emmerich nodded once and raised his hand, not the one with the brush, the empty one, and from it light spilled, not blinding, not divine, just final, a soft illumination like the underside of eyelids before sleep. And from the black stone, the painting began anew. The painting did not spread like fire. It spread like forgiveness, soft, slow, inevitable. Where the black stone platform met the hill, color began to rise. Not bright, not bold, but muted strokes of ochre, ash, and silver gray. These were not the hues of a new world blooming into life. They were the colors of a world receding. Each stroke erased something gently. A lamppost dissolved into the suggestion of smoke. A bench became nothing more than a smudge of burnt umber. A path turned inward and curled like a question mark drawn by a hand that no longer needed answers. The 7 remaining figures at the top of the hill watched this undoing in silence. The baker's widow did not cry. She simply placed the small wooden cart on the ground, turned it once with her foot, and let it roll. It made it halfway down the slope before it vanished mid-turn. Not like a trick, not like an illusion, just softly absorbed like ink into cloth. The cart left no sound, no echo, not even a breath of wind to suggest it had ever existed. The widow exhaled and took her first step forward. No one stopped her. The others did not speak. They simply followed, one by one. Each step brought a soft sound behind them. Not the crunch of grass, not the hush of dirt, but the sliding hiss of a brush on canvas. It grew louder with each pace, as if they were being drawn as they moved, as if they were becoming part of a final layer. The last to move was the boy, youngest of them all. He did not look back, only upward, at the blank frame in the sky, now glowing so brightly it had begun to pulse. A heartbeat, a countdown, a metronome. The boy raised his hand, as if to wave to something no one else could see, then stepped forward, and was gone. The hill, once green and real and filled with birdsong, now shimmered in dull light. The painter stepped forward from the circle, alone. His brush hovered inches above the stone. He did not lower it, not yet. Instead, he lifted his face toward the sky, toward the final frame, and spoke a word no one heard, but everyone remembered, not as sound, as feeling, closing, a soft door click, a child sighing into sleep, and the brush descended, not with force, with grace. One final line across the platform, a single horizontal stroke, long and elegant, like the horizon of a world that had never known night. And everything stopped. The framed no longer moved. The buildings no longer flickered. The canvas ceased its shifting. The figures froze mid-breath, mid-step, mid-forgetting. And in the center of it all, Emmerich stood, unfinished, his own edges blurred, his outline trembling. The brush fell from his hand, clattered once against the stone, then rolled to a stop beside the mirror, still open, still rippling, still showing what could have been. And above, the frame in the sky began to fade. Its light shrank inward, curling like paper pulled into firelight, not burned, just undone, unthreaded, as though it had never hovered at all. The stars returned, not as they were, but as they had been remembered, scattered, soft, sad, a sky that felt like an apology. And somewhere in the deep stillness that followed, a bell rang, just once, clear, not from the chapel, not from the attic, but from inside the paint itself. And when it faded, nothing else came. Only silence. The silence of a painting that knows it is finished. No wind returned to the hills. No birds reclaimed the rooftops. No dew gathered on the stones at dawn. The world was still, but not dead, just completed. And like all things that are truly finished, it did not ask to be looked at. It only asked to be left unspoken. The painting that had once been Trevenk, layered, bent, remembered and remade, now lay flat under an open sky. Every stroke sat clean and dry, though no brush moved. Nothing bled, nothing shifted. It was not art. It was memory stilled. The buildings were outlines, no longer structures. The streets were soft veins of sepia. Even the trees had stopped trying to sway, drawn now in a careful arrangement of static curls. The frames stood exactly where they had been placed, but they no longer waited. They were not frozen. They were finished. Each one bore some remnant of their old selves. A pattern on a sleeve, the set of a shoulder, the curve of a smile, but none of them turned. None of them breathed. Not because they couldn't, because they didn't need to. A finished line does not ask to be redrawn. And Emmerich stood in the center. The rotunda beneath his feet no longer pulsed. Its black stone was now soft gray, as though dusted in decades. His brush lay at his side, motionless, the handle cracked. But still he stood, not triumphant, not weary, just still, as if even he did not yet understand what came next. The mirror remained open at his feet, its surface calm, but deep within, the reflection was not of the sky above. It showed a hallway, long, narrow, painted on both sides, a corridor of works that no one living had ever seen, portraits of figures with no names, landscapes with no countries, dreams with no dreamers. The hallway stretched, endless, and at its farthest edge sat an easel, empty, waiting, and somewhere, just beyond sight, footsteps echoed. Someone walking toward the easel, not fast, not hesitant, just coming. Emmerich lowered his gaze, saw the reflection, and smiled. It was the first smile he had made since he arrived. It was also the last, because when he looked up again, the rotunda began to lift. Not physically, not like a platform, but like a page being turned, the space itself curling upward, the world folding like parchment, the lines bending toward a spine that did not exist in dimension, only in decision. The painting was being closed, archived, sealed, not erased, just shelved, as if it had been read, now understood, and no longer needed to speak. The light faded, the colors dulled, the sky returned to a flat, unthinking gray, and the air, once thick with brushstroke and memory, became clean, empty, like a blank canvas. Only one thing remained, the copper bell, unpainted, untouched, unclaimed, resting in the center of the square that no longer existed. And beneath it, etched into the final layer of stone, one word, again. Not a signature, not a warning, just a quiet truth. Because paintings fade, and painters return, and somewhere across another valley beneath another sky, a boy is learning not to sleep. When the last brushstroke dried, the world held its breath. Not in fear, not in grief, but in respect, because something had been completed, and completed things, if finished truly, become sacred. The air above what had once been Trevenk no longer shimmered. The sky no longer cracked. The canvas no longer stretched. What remained was a kind of smoothness, an unnatural stillness, like glass laid over a memory. Birds flew overhead now, but never lower. Rain passed through the region, but never landed. The earth there would not take footprints. No moss grew, no roots dug, no seeds took hold. Cartographers marked the place as vacant ground. Historians argued about its location. Some said there had never been a town at all. Only the faint smell of turpentine on cold days. Only the soft ringing of a bell when no wind moved. Only the dream of a mirror hanging in the corner of your sleep. But those who remembered, those rare few who had stood in the painted streets and watched themselves vanish into lines, they carried something. Not trauma, not even understanding, just recognition. The kind of recognition that makes you step lightly in quiet rooms, that makes you check shadows for brushstrokes, that makes you glance at the corners of mirrors and wonder what's being painted just out of frame. Because the gallery did not close, it simply expanded, and you could feel it sometimes when you pass certain doors. Doors with chipped blue paint, doors that shouldn't lead anywhere, doors that seem to breathe slightly if you put your ear against them. They're not locked, they're not trapped, they're waiting, somewhere, far from the hills. A lighthouse keeper fell asleep with a sketchbook open across his chest and awoke to find every page filled with faces he did not recognize, but somehow missed. In a city library, a child pulled a book off the wrong shelf and found a folded canvas inside, still damp, with a painted eye that blinked once before drying into place. And in a cathedral's sealed basement, behind a crumbling arch, workers uncovered a wall painted with a town that no one remembered, under a sky of endless white. No one knows how many of these places exist. No one counts them, because the gallery has no walls, only frames, hung across time, stacked along silence, waiting not to be filled, but to be seen. And Emmerich? No one sees him, not clearly, but in every great work left unsigned, there's a shape in the background, half-faded, slightly out of proportion, face tilted toward something no one else in the piece is looking at. And in every museum that's ever reported an unexplained draft, a missing label, or a visitor caught weeping without knowing why, someone swears they heard a brush tapping against a jar, twice, softly, then silence, a grateful silence, because something somewhere has begun again. And the frame above the hills? Still blank, but closer now. The light has started to ripple again, and the air beneath it carries the faint scent of gesso. Somewhere, in a town that does not yet exist on maps, a boy stirs in bed with dry fingers and eyes that do not close. He doesn't know why he can't sleep. He doesn't cry. He doesn't ask. He simply listens. Each night, long after the village dogs have fallen silent and the last shutters have latched against the chill, he hears it, a faint brushing sound, like cloth pulled slowly across stone. And then always a pause, followed by two small, clear chimes, like copper meeting stone. He has never seen the bell, but he knows it's for him. The boy has no name, not because it was taken, but because no one has dared to give him one. Names are dangerous things. After all, when you do not sleep and your dreams arrive as ink under your fingernails, he draws constantly, not by choice. His hands move before his thoughts catch up. Walls, tables, the underside of chairs. Not crude scribbles, no. His drawings are precise, controlled, detailed in a way no child should understand. They follow strange curves and symbols. Sometimes they resemble faces, sometimes places, sometimes neither. And none of them are from this town. The local priest has spoken with the boy's mother. Softly, nervously, he recommends keeping all mirrors covered, just in case. The townspeople call the child the Pale One. He's not sick. He eats. He grows. But his skin has the thin translucency of parchment, and his eyes have begun to lose their color. His irises are now tinged with gray. If you look too closely, you can see faint brushstrokes in the whites. He doesn't speak, but he hums. And what he hums, others forget by morning, but wake with tears in their eyes. The apothecary claims he once heard the boy humming behind the stables and woke the next day with a new memory of a town he had never visited, beneath a sky that moved like fabric. It stayed with him for a week, then vanished. The memory, not the sky, but he still keeps a canvas nailed to the inside of his cupboard door. Blank, prepared, waiting. The boy's drawings now appear in other homes, not just his own. People wake to find strange markings on breadboards, carved lightly into the dust on windowsills, painted in water on cellar doors. Always the same spiral pattern, always 3 lines, always pointing toward the east, toward the hills. No one has lived in those hills for generations. They're considered cursed. Not loudly, no one says that word. They simply don't go. The boy has begun walking at night, only a few steps, always barefoot. His feet leave no sound on cobblestone, only a faint residue, like pigment in the air. like the whisper of something being primed. And above the town, above those eastern hills, the sky has started to ripple again. Only faintly, only when no one's looking, but enough. Enough for those who have seen the paintings, those who've heard the rumors of Trevenk, and the painter who never blinked, to begin asking questions again. Quietly, politely, from far away. And when they arrive, wandering scholars, tired cartographers, old women with bells sewn into their sleeves, they all ask the same thing. Has he chosen yet? They never say who. They never say for what. But they all leave the boy small gifts. Ink, worn brushes, bits of canvas wrapped in cloth. One left a mirror, framed in bone. The boy hasn't looked into it. Not yet. But he places it at the foot of his bed each night, face up. And each morning, it reflects nothing but clouds. Even when the sky is clear, even when the room is dark, even when the boy leans over it, eyes wide. Only clouds, rolling, shifting, priming. The mirror began to change on the boy's 12th night of silence. Not abruptly, not with drama, just differently. That morning, when the boy placed it on the wooden floorboards as always, bone frame outward, glass turned toward the ceiling, it didn't reflect the clouds. It reflected walls. Not his walls. Not of wood or plaster or stone, but walls painted to look like walls, impossibly smooth, too perfect, gently warped at the corners as though bent by a forgotten hand. And as he leaned closer, something else shimmered into view. An easel, empty, waiting, in a room without a door, without windows, just white, endless. A stillness so deep that the mirror itself began to hum, softly like breath on glass. The boy reached toward it, one hand trembling not from fear, but from familiarity, as if he had done this before, as if he would do this again. But just before his fingertips touched the glass, a line appeared, not in the mirror, on the floor beneath him, thin, blue, brushed into the boards. It hadn't been there the night before. It hadn't been there seconds ago. But now, it stretched across the floor, curving gently toward the door. He didn't follow it at first. He only watched it. And then, after a breath too long to measure, he stood, bare feet silent, and walked. The line continued outside, across the garden path, beneath the fence, into the fields. It was not chalk, not ink, not paint as anyone in the village understood it. It was suggestion. It existed not to be seen, but to remind the world what it was supposed to become. The boy followed, and as he did, the moon above grew still, not fixed in place but hesitant, as if it, too, had noticed the line and did not wish to disturb it. Behind him, the town began to dream, all at once. Everyone, every house, every animal. The baker dreamed of a town made entirely of spiral staircases. The priest dreamed of weeping frescoes that painted themselves. The blacksmith dreamed of an anvil with a beating heart. And they all dreamed in the same palette. 3 colors, blue, ochre, white, the palette of memory, of undoing, of invitation. And at the edge of the field, where the hills rose in gentle folds, the line stopped, curled, closed into a spiral, and at its center, a canvas, stretched, silent, propped against a fence post that hadn't been there the day before. Clean, empty, not blank, hungry. The boy sat before it, not hesitating, not trembling, just present. And behind him the mirror shimmered, no longer showing the easel, now showing him, not as he was, but as he would be, older, still-eyed, holding a brush, a world behind him still half-formed. And above him, in the reflection, the same frame that had once hung over Trevenk, now beginning to pulse again, not just with light, with heartbeat, because something had been completed, and something else was now beginning. And beginning things, they never whisper, they hum. The brush arrived without hands. It was not carried, it was not gifted, it simply was. When the boy awoke beside the canvas, it sat there, balanced across his knees, bristles soft, handle smooth, still warm. Not from sun, not from fire, but from use. though it had never been held. He knew it by name, though he had never heard it spoken. He lifted it gently, reverently, like lifting a sleeping thought. Its weight was perfect, the silence expectant. The canvas before him did not rush him. It stood open and patient as all beginnings do, and the boy, without glancing back, made the first stroke. It was simple, curved, like a river bending between two hills. But the moment it was complete, the world shifted. The trees behind him leaned slightly inward, as if acknowledging the motion. The clouds overhead flattened, becoming brushy and wide, and the soil beneath his feet grew quiet, not in stillness, but in attention, like earth holding its breath. Far away, the villagers began to wake from their dreams. Slowly, tenderly. None of them spoke. None of them remembered what they had seen, but all of them stood at their windows, just once, just for a moment, as if listening for a sound that no longer lived in the world, but in the air behind it. The boy painted a second line, and the canvas responded, not by changing color, not by shimmering, but by remembering. From that second stroke emerged texture, the faint suggestion of bark, of gravel, of wind-swept linen caught in a moment of deciding whether to fall or float. The third stroke opened the sky, not the real one, the one inside the canvas. A sky already half-formed, waiting only to be named. The boy paused. He had not planned these strokes. He did not think them through. He simply followed what the brush asked of him. Because the brush did not draw what was there. It drew what had once been, and might one day be again. The mirror behind him flickered. Its image changed, not to the boy, but to the canvas itself. But not as it looked now, as it would look when it was done. A town, small, gentle, half-painted. People paused in doorways. Bells hung from iron arches. Candles flickered in windows drawn in soft yellows and muted reds. But one thing in the painting remained unfinished. A door, at the far end of the square, wide, tall, open, and inside that door, nothing. Not emptiness, not darkness, just potential, just frame. And in the mirror, something began to knock. 3 times, slow, measured, not threatening, not asking, just calling. The boy did not turn. He only looked at the brush, then at the door in the painting, and smiled. A tired smile, a knowing smile, the kind of smile you only make once when you realize you are no longer the one holding the brush. You're only the hand it needed for now. And somewhere, behind the hills, another canvas stirred. Still blank, still sleeping, but listening, always listening. The door in the painting never changed position. Always open, always dark, always waiting. But with every stroke the boy added to the canvas. Every curved rooftop, every soft shadow underfoot, every distant lantern. The doorway grew more real, not detailed, present. It was the only part of the painting that didn't need to be painted. It had always been there. At first, the boy avoided it. He painted around it, letting it sit in the corner, undisturbed, like a pause at the end of a sentence that you're not quite ready to finish. But the brush pulled gently toward it. Each time his wrist turned, as though magnetized to what it already knew. The boy resisted, then he accepted, and finally he painted into it. Only once. One stroke. A long, thin line down the left edge of the doorway, like light slipping through a crack in memory. And with that, something breathed. Not behind him, not from the hills, from inside the painting. It was a slow, steady inhale, like fabric being stretched taut, like canvas being pulled across a frame that no longer fit this world. The mirror behind him responded first. His glass fogged, his frame quivered. Then, with no warning, it fell forward, face down, cracking on the grass but not breaking. Because mirrors like this do not shatter. They remember. The boy didn't flinch. He only placed the brush beside it, and stood. The painting was almost finished. The town inside it now looked more real than the one behind him. The wind inside the image stirred leaves in corners that did not yet exist. A cat sat perched on a wall that had never been built, and someone, somewhere, had had begun to light a lamp beneath a window where no one had yet lived. But the door remained open, and so the boy stepped forward, not toward the canvas, into it. There was no flash, no music, no unraveling of reality, only one simple sound, the quiet hush of a brush rinsed in water, swirled once, then placed on a cloth to dry. And then he was gone. The canvas stood untouched, unfinished, but not alone, because something stirred just behind the door now. A shape, a hand, a hum, and the final brushstroke, though never placed, had already been decided. The sun set behind the field that evening with no one to watch it. No one but the cracked mirror. And above, just barely visible in the quieting light, the sky held one more frame, smaller than before, dimmer, but pulsing, waiting. The frame above the hills stopped pulsing sometime after midnight. Not suddenly, not with ceremony, just quietly, as if someone had stepped away from the easel and turned out the lantern. No one saw it dim. No one watched it fold into the sky like a closing eye, because by then the village was still, not asleep, not dead, just paused, as though the act of painting had not only created a new world, but gently held the breath of the old one. And in the soft dawn that followed, there were no birds, no footfalls, no bells, only the canvas. It remained in the field where the boy had once sat, where the brush had been left beside the cracked mirror. Dew had gathered on the grass, but none clung to the painting. The air around it bent slightly the way heat bends distance. Not warm, not visible, just not quite right. Those who found it eventually did not touch it. They stood in silence. 5 travelers, not from the town, not from the region, from elsewhere, from places with their own missing streets, their own forgotten names, their own dreams that ended in corridors of color. They stood at the edge of the canvas and listened to what none could say, but it was there, a sound not made by throat or wind, a sound made by remembering. One of them reached down, not for the canvas but for the brush. They lifted it, held it upright. The bristles were dry, but something flickered in their hand. A tremor, a thread, a suggestion, and the sky above them flickered once. A shimmer of frame, not solid, not full, just a sketch, a whisper, like a cough from the lungs of a long-forgotten god. And in that moment all 5 travelers felt it. The world was not finished. It never would be, because painting was not an act of closure. It was an act of survival, of retelling, of folding memory until it fits again. And someone somewhere would always be next. The one who doesn't sleep, the one who hums in hallways, the one who sees the corners of mirrors ripple like water. And when that one is ready, the canvas will appear, as it always has, as it always will, not waiting to be found, just waiting to be held.